If you imagine every child that was killed, that's somebody's cousin, that's somebody's son, that's somebody's nephew, that's somebody's neighbor.
This is Dr. Osman Latiff, Crusades historian and expert in Al-Quds, Jerusalem, Palestine, and someone who's carried out extensive postdoctoral research into empathy, dehumanization, and othering in conflict. He's going to be lifting the veil on the mechanics of dehumanization used against people from the Nazi Holocaust all the way to the ongoing occupation, ethnic cleansing, and attempted genocide of the Palestinians. How has our language, media, and politics dehumanized Palestinians? And more importantly, how do we rehumanize them? Stay tuned to find out in this episode of Empowered by Islam 21C, our new podcast where we collaborate with leading voices to discuss Islam solutions to 21st century challenges and trends. So your postdoctoral research was in empathy and othering in conflict. Can you just tell me a bit about what you have to say vis-a-vis that and what we're seeing unfold in Palestine in these last few weeks?
I think what we're seeing right now is a manifestation of the reality of what othering, dehumanization actually not only are but produce in a real human level. Remember, othering is a kind of a mechanism of dehumanization, that is the stripping away of all of the codes of what makes us and makes us recognize each other as human. And if we deny that on another people, that means we are effacing them. In fact, it's self-effacing to begin with, because we're denying something in our own consciousness and we're imputing the worst of us onto somebody else. And right now, in fact, the Palestinians in Gaza not only have been called human animals by the IDF, the Israeli Defense Minister, but of course they're being treated like animals, as if they're, of course, in a cage. And if you multiply the fact that they're in a surrounding, so structural otherness, the fact they're in a surrounding which is like called the open air, the largest open air prison in the world, and as if it's a cage, and then you call them human animals. In people's imagination, those of course who are not attuned to the suffering of the Palestinians for a long time, would see that being played out in terms of a zookeeper fighting against wild animals, and that in fact is shown in the barbarity expressed and shown in the destruction of Gaza, in the killing of its people, in the killing of innocent men, women, children, in the blowing up of schools, of hospitals, like yesterday, for example. And of course, that really is, in our world today, the manifestation of what othering, dehumanization is in a very real sense.
We see kind of othering and dehumanization, obviously on the part of the Israelis as a tool to kind of keep up the ongoing siege, ongoing oppression of Muslims in Gaza and in the West Bank and even within what they're calling Israel. But one thing that many people have noticed is the world seems to be split, right? You see those maps going around, the vast majority of the world in terms of geography and in terms of, people are pro-Palestine liberation in one sense or another. But you see a very few examples of some countries, Western countries that are predominantly, white or former European colonies, right? The US and Australia, they tend to be supporting and showing unconditional support for the what I call the last remaining colony in the Middle East, Israel. And it's also telling that these countries are also themselves at the grip of the scourge of right-wing populism and far-right kind of ethno-nationalism spreading amongst them. So there's also something about who our countries see as human and who they see as subhuman. Who, because in all intents and for all intents and purposes, the Israelis are practically just of European descent. They're white. They're virtually indistinguishable from, the white race, so to speak, in these countries, and there has to be that level, that understanding as well. Whereas the Palestinians are shown as brown-skinned, kind of dusty-faced, dishevelled, kind of almost on that, even in the presentation, that kind of less than human, or somehow the third world, and Israel is hailed as the shining beacon of whiteness, which is effectively what people want to say, but then they don't say, in the Middle East. In fact, the non-white Jews, they get treated terribly within Israel as well themselves. And it is also, what can you say about how our countries, how our mainstream media, how our politicians practice this double standard, or the selective outrage over the killing of people who are seen as human, and the killing of people who are seen as kind of collateral damage, or they had it coming, or they're human animals, this kind of stuff.
I think you've mentioned the important things there, Salman, because the key word is the word selective. The fact that we have not just a moral consistency in us, even though we proclaim moral compassion, but is there moral consistency in the way that we treat and deal with other people who are suffering? Remember, of course, that we're talking about people who have, aside from Palestinians, who have suffered years of colonialism, have been victims and subjugated to oppression, to colonialism in different ways and methods and forms. And I think that there is a more of a human element of compassion exerted towards Palestinians and their suffering from those who have already observed and felt the effect of colonialism and subjugation from other parts of the world. I think there's more of a human empathy from those who have suffered, and who empathy is a degree of perspective taking, and you can perspective take more with those that you've suffered with. In fact, empathy means with suffering, as opposed to sympathy meaning with suffering, and empathy is in suffering. And so that broader degree of human empathy, I think, is expressed particularly from those who have seen or felt or know stories of the tragedies afflicted upon them or by those that they're familiar with. I think that this is, in fact, not so much new in our world. Of course, people have suffered before as a consequence of a predominance in the world, a barbarity in the world expressed towards indigenous, you might say, weaker people. The suffering afflicted upon the Aborigines, for example, the black people of America, the Native Americans. All of these, in fact, were native indigenous people like the Palestinians. But they had above them, over them, people intent on their subjugation, intent on their annihilation, and using all different ploys and methods and means. You mentioned the importance of color of a people's skin. I think this is very, very important because remember that when people dehumanize others, they're looking for a very small difference in a people. And the purpose is to take the small difference and to magnify it and make it so that the small difference is so meaningful as to relegate those others as undeserving of what the self or the host people are deserving of. Dehumanizing is to believe that other people are not as deserving as oneself is. So on the one hand, what you have to do is you have to create the self. You have to first invent the self. That means you have to depict oneself as perfect, as morally good, as morally compassionate, as virtuous, righteous, and then of course the other that you're depicting is not morally good. He's going to be defined as bad, and if he's bad, then he can't be good. If he's good, then he can't be bad. As someone inferior, Lenderman's research, 1989, looked at political cartoons in America, looking at the way that Arabs, particularly Palestinians, were shown on TV in America, and particularly during the Intifada, Palestinians. And Arabs were vilified as uncultured, uncivilized, as barbarous, as villainous, as weak, as inferior. This had a very big effect in terms of giving support to the Israelis in their campaign against Palestinians, because already a stereotypical image of the Arabs vis-a-vis the Palestinians is being shown, and therefore it justifies the war against Palestinians. And I think the same is true, in fact, today. My book, I've written 2 books, in fact, on empathy. One being on being human, how Islam addresses othering, empathy, humanity. You can find this free as an ebook on sapiensuit.org website. But I have another book, which is an academic book from a postdoc, called Navigating War, Dissent, and Empathy in Arab-US Relations, Seeing Our Others in Darkened Spaces, published by Springer a few years ago. I looked at these kind of negative tropes in the way that Arabs are projected. You mentioned words like dusty, disheveled. So I looked at the way that images have a very big effect in affecting people's imagination, mindset to do with other people. Now, when it comes, for example, to Palestine, you'll notice Gaza, for example, you'll see images of broken buildings, destroyed buildings. You'll see people suffering en masse. You'll see people walking along as refugees en masse. You'll see the destruction of it. And when I see that, it reminds me, in fact, of a very of a song composed by Loki, in fact, called Grenfell, about the Grenfell Towers, and he has this anaphoric line called "Rooms Where," and "Rooms Where" is like this anaphoric line in the poem where you're forced to consider what was yesterday and what is today. Rooms where, and rooms where yesterday where you had furniture and settings that are humanized, and rooms now we don't have that anymore. And this, of course, I speak about this at length in my book. One of the there was a man called S. Yizhar, is a pen name. He wrote a book called Kibret Kizay. It's a historical fiction of the Nakba, of the 1948 destruction of Palestine, the forced expulsion of Palestinians from their homes. And he's writing about it as an Israeli Jew, by the way, because he was so taken aback by the level of insane victimization of the Palestinians. In one of his chapters, he writes about the fact that illegal settlers are now entering Palestinian homes. And he said that these were homes in which the female touch hath been, meaning the homes are already constructed, you already have furniture in place, you have already have rooms, ornaments, already somebody has lived there. And then he says, and won't the walls scream? Won't the walls scream that we've already lived here before? And so the element of rooms where, meaning the past, not just seeing dilapidated, destroyed buildings of Gaza, those were homes once upon a time, just like yesterday. There were hospitals and schools and homes and mothers and fathers and all of that existed there. So, but if we're only seeing destruction, then of course it's agreeing with the idea that perhaps these are people who are so barbaric, uncultured, uncivilized that they belong to those dusty settings. I look at, for example, the war in Iraq in my book, and I compared it. I have chapters of comparison with America, with the school massacres, for example, Virginia Tech, and comparison with Iraq and modes of suffering and the way the empathy bearing is shown and everything else. One thing you'll find in Iraq, in the Iraq war, is that those notions of individuality in the Arab Iraqi Muslim expression were absent. You'll find that people were shown as en masse, but not individual.
As groups.
Yeah, and so
and painted using broad brushstrokes. I remember you saying as well.
That's really what, because when you dehumanize, you have to imagine there is a mental canvas in your mind, and you're using broad strokes and wide brushes, and you're painting an image of something or somebody other than you. And by imputing all of the worst of you into that other person, that's how you create the savage other. And you're not allowing for fine grades of distinction, to allow the identity to emerge in that person. And I think that's happening right now with people of Gaza, because they're not given. In fact, on the one hand, in fact, they are given because of the rise of social media and the fact that particularly Muslims and those who are supporting the Palestinian cause realize the importance of showing that every single, it's like that's somebody. So if you imagine that word somebody's, if you imagine every child that was killed, that's somebody's cousin, that's somebody's son, that's somebody's nephew, that's somebody's neighbor. Every mother, that's somebody's mother, that's somebody's aunt, that's somebody's grandmother, that's somebody's. It places that person in a human frame. If we don't do that, then of course we're guilty of being unable to rehumanize the people who have suffered so much, years and years of dehumanization. And in fact, that's really what gives the Israeli, the propaganda machine, its fuel. The fact that on the one hand you can have Israeli populace humanized because they're shown as being civil and enlightened and clever, and on the other hand you have the barbarians over there. And I think that the purpose for us, of course, is to show that the barbarians over there are human, have feelings, have lives, are immensely important, and the fact that we should, of course, remember that the othering is by denying them that sense of humanity.
And there's a lot to unpack there, and one of the things that I want to talk about today is also, of course, how do we rehumanize the Palestinians? And like especially when it comes to our duty on social media, for example, the democratization of information. The humanizing narratives are becoming too loud to ignore now. I don't know if you've noticed, if you felt this as well, but this time, even on the mainstream media, it's becoming too loud to ignore. They have to interview more Palestinians. They have to interview both sides. They have to give some attention to the actual human suffering on the ground. So I do want to get into what we can do, but before that, you mentioned a few things on how othering or otherization happens and dehumanization happens. So you mentioned, denial of human codes of recognition, denial of people's finer details and their individual identities, looking at people as groups, setting up this us and them, so setting up the self as X, Y, Z, and then the other as like a placeholder to project one's own insecurities and one's own kind of negative features onto. How else does othering happen? How else does dehumanization happen in from your research?
Well, the books I've written, in fact, look at different modes of otherization or othering. We have, of course, on the one hand, this sense of mechanical otherization, and that is that we look at others through a structural lens. And by the way, structure is not just a demographic distancing, it's also a moral and psychological distancing. So if we, for example, think about the way that people are distanced in our world, they seem far. They might be close, but they seem far. How do people get to seem far? They could be because they're represented as culturally different to us or emotionally different to us, and therefore we castigate them as far from us. There are, of course, micro ways of us considering that I have in my book. For example, people who are disabled, who are wheelchair bound, for example, who are mentally disabled. All of these people can be and perhaps are in some ways othered in human society because they're not given the same credits as those who are fit and able and healthy. They're not the same. They're not seen as the same. Whereas from the Islamic paradigm, of course, the Prophet ﷺ was very sure to impart upon his companions the importance of seeing everybody not through a physicality, but in terms of the spiritual essence of the human being. In akramakum indallah atqakum, the most noble of you with Allah are those who have the most taqwa, fear of Allah, piety amongst you, not the human element in you. In fact, there were companions who were like the man who was blind from Banu Waqif, and the Prophet told his companions, come there, see the man from Banu Waqif, and he was fully blind. And the Prophet said, let's see the one who has al-basir, the one who has perception and vision. And the ulama, they say that this is because the Prophet didn't see the man as blind. His heart was alive. And Allah in the Quran says, there is not the hearts that grow blind, there is eyes that grow blind. It is not eyes, but there is a heart that grow blind. But the man's heart was awake and alive. And likewise, you had others who were dark-skinned, Bilal al-Habashi, and you have others who were mentally ill, like the woman who had all these things, in fact, are discussed in my book on being human. But the point is that we have these potentials as human beings to castigate others as being less worthy than ourselves. The important thing, of course, in Islam is that Islam has existed with other civilizations, other religions for a long time. We've had Jews lived with us in Islamic Muslim civilization. You have Christians, you have Zoroastrians. Therefore, Islam knew how to deal with others with respect to their differences, but it never castigated those others as being as undeserving, unworthy. They lived by their own principles. But the point is that when it comes, for example, if you look at the way that the Western world, you might say, Western world has dealt with people who are different to them, it's very different to the way that Muslims have dealt with. Like, for example, with the Crusades, you had Muslims who already knew about the Christians before the Crusades, whereas in the Western world, you didn't have Muslims who lived with the Christians before the Crusades. Therefore, that had a very big bearing on their impression that they had of the Muslims. Likewise, the Jews, likewise to the people. So I think that that's important for us to consider.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it just reminded me of Jonathan Lyon's book, Islam Through Western Eyes, and the subtitle was From the Crusades to the War on Terror. So he charts. I mean, your PhD was in Crusader history, so you know this, that the way Islam has been portrayed and projected is of the Muslims have been the quintessential other of the what became the Western European.
Yeah, and even you mentioned,
And we see.
for example, sorry to cut you off there, so the element of color, because they projected the Muslims as Turks, and the Turk was the Moor, and the Moor was a darker skinned person. Even though you're speaking about, for example, the Inquisition, native Spaniards who embraced Islam, but that was used as a kind of a motif of otherness. It's like, for example, in contemporary times, I wrote a book in 2019 because of the shooting in two masajid in Christchurch, New Zealand, by Brenton Tarrant, who killed more than 50 Muslims praying in the masjid on Jum'ah. But in his work, in the manifesto that he wrote, he spoke about the fact that Muslims are today's Turks. And he references Urban II in Crusade. He said, what would Urban do? For example, he asked the question rhetorically. The fact that he sees Muslims as darker skin, and because they're darker skin, they can't be as pure and noble and as good as the whiter skinned people. And this was in fact used also in the Tempest by Shakespeare, was used a lot in Western civilization. It had an impression bearing on how the people who are far, not only because remember Spain is in Europe, so not demographically far afield, but culturally and morally and psychologically far afield from them.
Yeah, and hence the process of race being something relative and constructed by human beings, right? Rather than ethnicity, which is something, a fact about you or your lineage. But your race is something, one person might be considered white in one place, the master race, so-called, and that same person may be considered black politically and socially in another place.
Malcolm X, when he went on the Hajj, he said that he met people who were whiter skinned, but they didn't see the world with their whiteness. I met black people, they didn't see the world from their blackness. The idea is that you could be white, fine, Allah made you like that, but you can't see the world from that whiteness or that blackness. Allah has given you something which is far greater, superior than that. And that is, of course, that moral intuition that he had that is focused on serving and adoring your divine creator, as opposed to living on these human constructed modes of selfness. That's the key point.
Yeah, subhanAllah. So so you mentioned that there's structural changes and differences, the way that people are otherized, and there's the racial element as well, the concoction of the us and them, and presenting people as a lighter or darker, metaphorically or even literally. But I mean, there's also the matter of language as well, right? When we see how people's lives are portrayed, or casualties, for example, you'll have seen the headlines of BBC or Sky News or whatever. When it's a Palestinian, it's a Palestinian. When it's an Israeli, it's Israeli people. When Palestinians are killed, they die. Palestinians died. When Israelis die, they're killed. When we in Islam 21C as well, we're always quite conscious of our wording as well, because there are some frames that are inherently legitimizing and some that are inherently delegitimizing. As an army is a legitimate kind of thing, a government. If you want to portray someone as human, you call and as part of your in-group, you talk with these types of legitimizing words. But if they're the other, then they're a militia, they're fighters, they're a regime. Maybe they're not an army, they're not a government, they're a regime. When they take prisoners, they're called hostages, but when we take prisoners, they're called prisoners. Do you see this? How do you see this, the language as part of this dehumanization, rehumanization battle?
For sure, yeah. I have a chapter in my book called the language of dehumanization, the psychology of dehumanization. That is that these are euphemisms of language. So the fact that you're using constructed vocabulary that reduces a particular emotional, outlet from a people, and you implant in its place something else. And so the fact that, but this is not new, this is something very old. Like you mentioned, examples in the past where people have been regarded as, in fact, in Britain, for example, you had the IRA in Ireland, and you had torture of these paramilitary groups in Ireland, but they called it intensive interrogation. They didn't call it torture, but something that would make a response from a person that is far more acceptable than intensive interrogations. In Palestine, when they torture Palestinians, they call it moderate physical pressure. So as opposed to torture, moderate physical pressure, meaning it doesn't sound that bad if it's moderate physical pressure. The Nazis, when they gassed the Jews, they called it charitable foundation for. In fact, when they gassed the mentally handicapped, the mentally ill in Poland and Germany, they called it charitable foundation for institutional care, which in fact sounds wonderful. But that was a way of legitimizing the evil being done on other people. And I think that in our world today, as you mentioned, Israelis could be humanized by being defined as people who have simply died or killed, for example. But the Palestinians, of course, are not given that credence, not given the worth and value. By being only Palestinians, they remain as an othered, distant entity and not brought fully into the human frame. And I think that the language, of course, has a very big effect in doing that. It is upon us in terms of how we rehumanize, like you mentioned before, the struggle of a people, who maybe in themselves. This is very key, because remember that there's two ways or even three ways in which we think about perception. So it's a bit like the way that W.E.B. Du Bois in The Souls of Black Folk wrote about the suffering of black people in America. And he said that on the one hand, you have we trying to be ourselves as black people, and number two, we have the white people in America, or let's say the ones who are pro-slavery, imputing upon us a perception. Therefore, they're living a life and have already developed a perception of us. And number three, we're bound by that perception. So we have three perceptions happening all simultaneously. Our own one that is constructed because of our own culture and ethics and religion, whatever. Number two, we have the white one. And number three, we have the one that's floating in the air. That's that we're supposed to live up to that standard. And I think that we should not speak about Palestinians as if they're less than humans. They're human beings and they're Muslims. And the fact that they're Muslims, of course, Allah gives them that great sense of superiority for us as believers, recognize them as believers in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's by itself, that's just enough said. But remember that we're speaking about, on the one hand, how they perceive of themselves as fully human. I know it's sad me even saying that because of course they're human, but the way that the world is perceiving of them, and the way that they are bound or almost forced to live by that impression of what the world considers to be naturally right, naturally civilized, naturally good. Whereas we shouldn't allow for that to happen. We shouldn't accept that. We shouldn't accept that for a people. The Palestinians are human as they are, subhanAllah, and beautiful as they are, and civilized as they are, and mature and clever as they are, subhanAllah. There was a girl who was killed just a few days ago in one of the bombings, and she had achieved the highest marks out of all the girls in her school, subhanAllah. She had 99% something, and it showed her speaking about her achievement, and she was killed in a bombing. Allahu Akbar. May Allah give the girl Jannah. May Allah give sabr to her family. But that happens in Gaza, even though it's constructed as a cage to force the people in that sense of subjugation. One of the things, it's so tragically ironic that even in Nazi Germany, in Poland, for example, in Auschwitz, they denied the Jews food, because the idea of Himmler and Horst and Adolf Eichmann was to ensure that the Jews look like animals, they act like animals. There was a psychology involved in. I've seen the wall in Birkenau, Auschwitz, where they would kill the Jews. This is before the gas chambers. But then there was a realization that the more they're doing of this, the more the closeness involved would create empathic connection, because they're seeing blood and they're seeing the person screaming for life, begging for life. And then they realized that the gas chambers is a kind of a mechanical distancing, because they would say things like, we're not killing, it's just like the fans are killing, the fans are doing it. Nowadays, what is happening is that somebody flying a fighter jet is pressing a button, the bomb is dropping, or somebody flying a drone somewhere else, another country, is pressing a button, the bomb's dropping, and innocent people, civilization, animals, orchards, trees, schools, masajid, all being destroyed in one instant. But we don't appropriate the same level of blame on the one who was taking a knife and stabbing someone, one person, a heinous, horrific act of violence, than we do for the person pressing the button and killing loads of people. And it's even before the bomb even drops, he's miles away in the sky. We don't give the same level of. There's a very good book called On Killing by Dave Grossman, and his chapter is called Altitude and Attitude. The fact that you're so high up, your attitude towards those people you're killing is gonna change and be different.
SubhanAllah. And this is partly why, I spoke to a member of an air force of a country. I won't mention who it is. He was quite up in that country's air force, and he left because he was and his colleagues were ordered to bomb places, and when they would fly down closer to the ground, they would see humanizing kind of structures. They would see people, farms, roofs of houses. When you're above the clouds, it's easier, but when he went down, he said, I refused to comply, and I don't want to get him in trouble by mentioning who he is, but he took a stand and he left. There's that when something's happening in close proximity, you're almost forced. There's something in the fitrah that takes over, that forces you to recognize human codes.
There is a group called Rehumanising. They are Israeli soldiers who refuse to serve in the IDF. I write about them in both of my books, Rehumanising, and I have quotes from the Rehumanising about what changed their minds. One of them said that I used to always think about the Nazis. How could a Nazi wake up in the morning and kiss his wife and embrace his child and go and gas people to death? Until I entered occupied territories. And I saw myself in the frame. I kiss my wife, I embrace myself, that I'm going off to torture and harm other people. I saw myself in that frame. And that's the key thing. The fact that closeness to human suffering. And remember that we might, for example, if you look at American soldiers who fought in Iraq, the level of PTSD levels has skyrocketed because they've engaged in killing, in torture, in injuring and wounding so many innocent people, a war based upon lies, and they've been at the front of it all, and they come back and they can't deal with themselves, they kill themselves, suicide. In fact, more people, American kill themselves than die in the war. So that's a key thing. Rachel Corrie, who was killed by the Israelis in 2003, she was part of the ISM, International Solidarity Movement, and she was defending.
They drove over her with a bulldozer.
She was defending the home of a Palestinian farmer, a pharmacist, Palestinian farmer, and she was defending his home. They bulldozed her to death. In her account, called, when her parents wrote, they collected her diary entries, and they wrote, and they have that in her name afterwards. But she wrote about Gaza. She visited Gaza and the West Bank, and she said about Gaza, she says that I've seen I've seen the labor of love and the care in Palestine, how Palestinians plant olive trees and how they cultivate and care and love olive trees and how their sustenance is based on olive trees. And he said, I've seen the way that you have farmlands, you have olive groves, and you have greenhouses. So Palestinians are protecting these things. And she said that I know if Uncle Craig, meaning someone back home for her, and Grandma were here, they would defend their gardens, with their teeth. The idea that you can make these associations, the fact that if you were there, how would you act? If you were in this, how would you respond? If you had been denied access to basic amenities in life for 75 years, captivated, if you were subjugated, if you were imprisoned in this situation, colonized in for so many decades, how would you respond? How would you do it? How would you do different to what they might be doing today? That's a key thing for us to ask, and I think Rachel Corey makes those associations for us to understand the importance of how we construct empathy in ourselves. One, of course, is through imagined storying. I have a chapter in my book about the killing of our sister Abir Qasim Hamza al-Janabi. We should know her name, Abir Qasim Hamza al-Janabi. She was 14 years old. I emphasize the word 14, her age, because an American media, they put her as 25 years old. She was 14 years old. She was killed by an American group of soldiers. Stephen Green led the assault against her. They mass raped her. They set her on fire. They killed her family. Her mother was Fikriya, father Hamza, sister Hadil. They killed all of them. They burned the whole house down. Then when they fled, they were caught. Stephen Green said in his account, "I did not see the Iraqis as humans. I didn't see the Iraqis as humans." So that in his mind, there were Hajjis. And of course, Hajjis is like an honorific title. Someone performed the Hajj. But Hajj was seen as a dehumanizing label. It was seen as an other, as dehumanized, as a Hajji is someone that's different. And that's because they didn't appreciate the cultural association with the word Hajji, or seeing Iraqis, even though you've bombed their country and you've reduced it to rubble, they're still living as human beings, subhanAllah. They wake up with the same air and anticipations and hopes and dreams. When do we hear about that? When do we hear, for example, that any Palestinian child killed as a child that had hopes and dreams and fears and worries and things to look forward to, anticipations in life? All of those things, in fact, are humanizing currents for people. Whereas if you strip them of that, you're saying that they simply existed as a block, but has no sense of humanness in them. But of course, everybody does, and that's the key thing for us to remember.
They're just terrorists. They're just terrorists. This is the new.
It's terrorists.
This is the new N-word. This is the new Jew. This is the new subhuman. This is the new whatever the term is to render someone as subhuman enough and worthy of reparatory violence or oppression.
On that wall in Auschwitz-Birkenau, when they used to line the Jews up, they used to extract from their teeth like gold and take their cards and anything of worth that they could sell. And they would realize that on their identity cards, sometimes the victims had the same names, like as the mothers of the perpetrators. And that humanizing element would cause them something. It's a very good book called Ordinary Men. It's about the way that some Jews, they fight upwards. They refuse to shoot. Some Nazis fight upwards. They refuse to shoot because they didn't want to feel the element of guilt.
So they purposefully missed.
Yeah, they missed.
When
the fight up was rather than firing at the victims because of that element of and maybe there's many people, in fact, like that in the world today. Maybe there's many people, in fact, maybe there's many good people, even in America, for example, the parts of the world, who might see the news. And maybe they are surrounded by an environment that's kind of pro-Israel, for example. But they realize in their consciousness that this is something that's wrong. This is something that is so hideous. The fact that innocent babies and children are being killed and targeted, not just today, not just from October the 6th. The wall didn't start ticking from October the 6th or 7th. It's in fact for 70, 80 years of occupation, of theft of homes, of stealing of land, of stealing of resources, of settler expansion. All of these things are happening. Every one of those people has a story, as a humanized story. And in fact, Kibre Kizé, that's why he used a pen name for his book, because he knew that it's going to have a very negative reaction to people's mindset. He used a pen name to show that, where you're taking over the homes of people, who are humans just like you.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the reasons why the Palestinians they're saying that they're taking prisoners, so-called hostages, is because every time that happens, we've seen in the past the prisoners undergo a kind of de-radicalization, almost, that the brainwashing, the dehumanization kind of is undone, and they come out as, many of them, advocates for the Palestinian cause. Many, and not just the Palestinians, but anywhere in the world, anywhere there's a dehumanized people, and they take prisoners or hostages, or whatever. You think about Yvonne Ridley, for example. When she was captured by the Taliban as a journalist, she came out. She saw them up close and personal. People begin to see and recognize the humanity in others if they're treated well. Obviously, we're not saying people should be harmed as prisoners, or prisoners should, but if they're treated as Islam says to treat prisoners of war, for example, as Islam says to treat those who are captives from battle and so forth, they end up seeing you as a human being, and start rehumanizing. So that's one of the reasons why. And we see that, I remember I mentioned this in the last episode, the Indian pilot who was shot down. And whenever that happens, obviously there's a kind of diplomatic kind of solution that needs to be sought. But when they actually come into contact with each other, the two sides that are fighting, when they actually see them not with guns in their hands, but as maybe one of them is a prisoner, or they meet in a mutual kind of way. I remember in during World War II, they taught us back in high school that on Christmas Day they just when they were in the trenches, they broke out into a football match. So just like you begin to see the other side, as a human being, and start interacting with them on, not in the context of killing and shooting and so forth, but in the context of just having a cup of tea, or doing something normal, seeing people in their normal habitat and normal environment, so forth. So that's what's
Wilfred Owen, in fact, in the World War One, has much of this. In fact, he sadly died in the war. He was friends with Sigfrid Sassoon, the other poet, and we know from the margin entries of his poetry that Sassoon was editing his poem, but one of his poems wrote about this sense of like a dream of escape, of getting to the side of the enemy, and they talk about why they went to war. And Sigfrid Sassoon says it was to please the Meg, meaning to please the girlfriend. And even though many young people went to war at the same time, same age, because everybody else did. And so it wasn't because they wanted to prove themselves as noble, chivalrous, and to please their girlfriends. And then he realizes that the other side, they have the same ambitions. They wanted to please their girlfriends and make some quick money. So you're right in saying that. Allah in the Quran says, laysu sawa, they're not all the same. And we should remember that as Muslims, that maybe, and I made the point of the refuseniks for a reason. There are many on that side who are against the policies of their governments, who support the cause of innocent victimization of the Palestinians. There are many Jews who are, in fact, against Israel even. And so we don't paint everybody. In fact, that's how you otherize, by painting everyone with the same brush. That's stereotyping them. But to individualize each person, realize every person has their own level of consciousness. Perhaps some people are stuck in situations where the pressure from around them is forcing them to think one particular way. But everybody, of course, has their own heart and their own leading and their own choice in life. So we should not forget that. But I think that you're right in saying that by encountering others, and in the Prophet's time, there was a man called Thamama radiallahu anhu who was taken prisoner, and the Prophet passed him one day, and he says, "What can I do with you, Thamama?" And Thamama says, "Well, you have a choice. Either you could kill me and there'll be revenge. Either you can free me." Or he's giving, and the Prophet is leaving him. The second day, same question. Third day, same question. And the fourth day, the Prophet let him go. And Thamama says, he says, I used to think that the worst people on earth were you people, but now I think the best people on earth are you people. And the worst deen on earth was Islam, and the best deen on earth is Islam, and the worst person was you, but now the best person is you. So therefore, having an impression bearing on people when they see the reality of how people live and how they treat others. And of course, Islam is commanding us with those code of ethics from Islam about being good, about one of the beautiful things. There's a beautiful word in the Quran called athar and athar. So I was asking one of the local shuyukh about So you have athar where Allah in the Quran speaks about prisoners, and Allah says, وَيُؤْثِرُونَ عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ. Allah says they give others, they give others to themselves, yeah, even though they're in need. And so therefore the element of sacrificing for others, preferring others to themselves. But then you have athar in the Quran. So you have multiple times where athar is used more. Athar meaning imprints, landmarks, about impressions, athar. And so what is the connection between athar and athar here? And he says, because whenever you make a sacrifice for somebody else and you prefer them to yourself, you're leaving an impression on them, on their heart. That's so powerful. He says you're leaving, that's so powerful. He says you're leaving the impression on their heart. And I thought, wow, subhanAllah, that's so powerful and that's so true, because that a sense of association with people and seeing their human face and that conduct of just humanness has a very big impression bearing on their perceptions of what those people truly are in a very humanized sense. So.
Yeah, subhanallah. So that's what the Palestinians themselves on the ground, they can do that when they come into contact with people. But from our perspective here, sitting thousands of miles away, how can we rehumanize the Palestinians?
I think that one of the things, of course, is to so one of course is to say that, well, they're already human in their own frame. That's the first thing. From the perspective of other people do not perhaps appreciate that sense of humanity. I think the pen is very important. It's a very good book called Gaza Writes Back, which you can buy on Amazon. Gaza Writes Back. It's short stories by Palestinian Gaza authors from Gaza, called Gaza Writes Back, and it's about these kind of very human accounts of their life as short stories. We should buy books like that, teach them to our children. We should kind of promote the importance of Gaza from a very humanized perspective. There are, of course, many things we could do. When you think about, like, mentally, a sense of imagined storying, mentally, empathy, it means trying to put yourself in somebody else's position, perspective, take with them, what would you do if you were in that position, situation. They have a school, I have a school. That means I'm learning, that means they're learning, that means I have teachers, that means they have teachers. So kind of very simple processing in the human mind. We have to, of course, ensure that the stories are not forgotten, but they're told. By retelling the stories, we're in fact humanizing the narrative by retelling the stories. If we, for example, let's say we take, there are names that we would latch onto, names that have been popularized in media, names that have become associations or even memes, important names. But if we forget the element of the fact that every victim has a name, every victim had a story, every victim had a life, every victim had a brother who was somebody's mother, somebody's cousin, somebody's nephew. We're not doing justice, in fact, to helping to rehumanize what was lost. Rachel Corey spoke about the sense of the field of vision, the fact that we could have empathy, but do we have are people within the area of our care and concern, within the domain of our care and concern? Are they within that sense of, are they, or is there kind of displacement of vision and memory? That's the idea. That you might have, in fact, she speaks about a kid called Ali. Ali was a person in Corey's book who wanted to smell the sea, but he can't get too close because that's going to be a warning, a trouble for him. And people would say to him, "Yalla, yalla," and she would have in her book, "Yalla, yalla," meaning you need to go, or move from here, or la, la, meaning no, no. And but she wrote about the account of Ali. So, and Ali was blown up. She was killed by the IDF. Yeah, was killed. But his account is there, meaning that's Ali's story. And I think that it's like I think Sakhawi says, "Man arraha Musliman فكأنما أحياه." Whoever relates the tale of a Muslim as if he's given him life. If you narrate the tale of a Muslim as if you've given him life, so we give each other life by telling each other stories and events. And I think that those stories are powerful because they leave an impression on a person. They leave an impression on a person of how they can live their life or how other people live their life. And I think that the less that we have of that, because it's not just about you might say thousands have been killed, but each of those thousands has a life. If you name them, if you have a tally, a list of names, this person, that person, that person, that means every single life. It's not just one life gone, it's the life of that person and the mother and the son and the neighbor and the teacher. It's a whole paradigm around that person. That's how you humanize. You give life to the whole narrative. You don't, for example, if they're saying, for example, 1,000 kids have been killed, you don't repeat that. You say 1,000 human lives have been killed. 1,000 kids who had somebody's were killed. 1,000 mothers lost their children were killed. I mean, the whole thing has a much bigger uh, impression bearing on us and our character and our consciousness than it should have by relying on only immediate accounts of that suffering.
So one strategy to and tactic to challenge and undo dehumanization is to give details, narrate stories, give names. The somebodies is a good strategy to use to try and challenge dehumanization of Palestinians in public. And even, unfortunately, the next conflict that we see, whether it's Uyghurs, whether it's in Kashmir or Muslims in India or Syria, or even non-Muslims being, dehumanized somewhere, we have a duty to challenge this dehumanization and recognize and force people to recognize humanity in these people. What other kind of strategies and tips can you give to the audience? Maybe on social media we can do something. Maybe when we go to the next demonstration in public.
I think we should not,
what
we
can
should
we do?
not, of course, ever undermine now the power of social media. I think this is having a very big effect on the way that the public opinion is being affected, influenced because of social media. And I think that anybody who has a Twitter account, a Twitter handle, any account, social media, use it to just push forward the cases of not just the the accounts of suffering of people, but the human story involved in that. I think if we can do that, and just by even retweeting some important tweets, we should do that all the time, every day, to really affect the algorithms involved in this. We have a responsibility as Muslims now, whatever we can do to try and do. And I think that social media right now is truly crucial. There are ways, in fact, even I remember last year when you had that person, Yaakov, in some Palestinian woman's garden. Yaakov, he was standing there. And the lady, may Allah bless her and give her Jannah and give her goodness in life, was saying to him that you're in my garden, and you're in my garden, and you're sealing my house. And he said, but if I don't seal it, then somebody else would steal it. That went really viral. That whole thing, when Yaakov was standing in the garden, the whole thing went viral. Everybody saw that, and they realized, well, this is really what occupation means. Theft of home means this. Somebody standing in the lady's garden. Imagine it happened to you. Imagine someone else stood in your garden, locked the doors, barricaded themselves, and says, "This is where I'm going to be here." How would you feel? There are some very good YouTube videos, short videos, even movies, videos about what suffering, what occupation means, even in a kind of a westernized context. And I think that we have access to them online. We should spread them to our friends, neighbors, our teachers, our associates, and really make this a very broader concern for people to think about. Why are people resisting? Nelson Mandela said, I didn't, he said that, he said, I didn't, he said that violence was not something that we chose. It was something thrust upon us. He said, I didn't kind of decide upon recklessness or because of a love of violence. He said, I wasn't like that. But he said that because of years of brutality and exploitation and suffering that we experienced, we were forced in a situation. And I think that it's important for us to realize that if we explain to people that this is what the people in Palestine have experienced for decades long, the natural inhabitants, natives of that land, and they've been expelled from their land, and this is why they're, making their voice heard. I think that we have a responsibility to share that concern that they have. We are, of course, our brothers and sisters, with them, and I think that even attending, for example, demonstrations or campaigning or reading, learning about the history of Palestine. This is very crucial for us. Many people, in fact, don't know about the history of Palestine. We should learn about the events, about the dates, about the repercussions. We should learn about the Anbiya in Palestine who settled in that land, who lived in that. We should know about what makes that land of Palestine, Al-Aqsa, so important for us as Muslims. We should know about the life of Zakaria alayhi salam, Maryam and Hannah and Ibrahim alayhi salam, and so many prophets who lived and traveled in that land and settled down in that land. We should know about what makes that land important. We should know about the fadail. Half of my PhD was on the fadail of Al-Aqsa, Al-Quds. Half of the PhD was on that topic. And if I saw in my first book, I dedicate the first part of it to enumerating the virtues of Al-Aqsa and where the manuscripts came from and how they were assessed and who published them and that. I think that in those days in the Crusades, remember that in the Crusades, when Al-Aqsa was occupied by a foreign enemy, the Crusaders, they used different strategies. On the one hand, you had, of course, ulama and scholars and people like Ali ibn Tahir al-Sulami, who was the imam of the chief faqih of Umayyad Mosque, and he wrote his Kitab al-Jihad, the book of Jihad. And it was a way of pressing upon the sultans and the khalif to be responsible of taking action to repel the Crusaders. It was his job. You had poets, you had people like Al-Abi Wardi, Ibn Khayrat, you had others who were write poems about the injustices, about the women being imprisoned and about this and that. That was their responsibility. You had other people involved in this. So everybody has a capacity, responsibility, and never undermine reference. I'll say one thing. As-Sulami died 1107, I think, or 1106, writes his book 1105. Crusades happened in 1099. Al-Quds was taken. In 1187, when Salah ad-Din was preparing the Battle of Hittin, the penultimate encounter before the liberation of Al-Quds, Al-Aqsa, they were choosing which book to read and take inspiration from and to kind of help the army prepare themselves. And they didn't choose Ibn Mubarak's very famous Kitab al-Jihad, rahimahullah. They chose As-Sulami's Kitab al-Jihad. And so therefore, never undermine.
Many years later, yeah.
Yeah, so more than 80 years later, and he had died a long time ago. And by the way, we have manuscripts of people who were attendants in his gatherings were very few. They divided the book into small segments, and they had 5 or 6, 7 or 8. It was very few attendees. But when it was needed most later on, and it was used. Therefore, never undermine your efforts, your words, your drawings, your art, your poetry, your social media, your speeches, your donations, your charity. All of these things are very important. Therefore, I emphasize the importance. Number one, the importance of dua. Make dua, subhanallah. Every one of us should wake up for Qiyam al-Layl, for Tahajjud every night in your Salah, in Fajr prayer, your Qulub Nazila. Make dua for the Muslimin, for the Mustadafin, for the Muslims in Palestine, in Kashmir, of Hind, of all places, the Uyghur Muslims of China. Make dua for them. So dua is, the Prophet says, the weapon of the believer. The weapon of the believer, never undermine that weapon. Always make dua for the Muslim wherever in the sujood. The Prophet of Allah says the closest to his Lord is when he's in sajda, so increase in your dua. The importance of charity, of helping those who are in need. Subhanallah. Imagine if they're restricted, and of course, I don't say imagine, but I'd say it's a real event. They restricted the water. It's not as if it's imagination, they restricted the water. They forbade upon the people of Gaza water and food and electricity and fuel. That is upon us as Muslims. Of course, may Allah atone the Zalimeen for their dhulm, but upon us as Muslims to help them in their suffering. That's upon us as Muslims. So things like charity, dua, campaigning, protesting, learning about the history of Al-Aqsa, of Al-Quds, of narrating the lives of those who have suffered, who are suffering. That's upon us as Muslims in our small attempts to try and humanize their suffering, their struggle.
Jazakallah khair, Shaykh Uthman. There's lots of advice, lots of empowering stuff we can get doing right away for our brothers and sisters in Palestine and beyond. My last question is just please finish this sentence. If there's one thing you want the audience to take away from this podcast, it would be
not to forget your brothers and sisters in Islam, in Palestine and Gaza. not to forget. And I say the word forget because it's very likely that as the days pass and nights pass, we can, of course, forget. But I think that we should remember always. And how we remember? By putting things, a plan and action for us, for our families. If you make this a life commitment, that whenever the downtrodden people, oppressed people, will always be the first to help alleviate their suffering as best as we can, for as long as we can. That's, I think, the key thing.
Jazakallah khair, Shaykh Uthman.
Allah bless you.